Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my poetry and nonfiction reading from the end of 2022. I'll start with the book that I don't have a lot to say about, and that was Ocean Vuong's Time as a Mother. I listened to the audio version of this, and that may have been the wrong choice. I don't know. I loved his novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and I really liked Night Sky and Exit Wounds, something like that. But this just seemed very bland to me, and there were word choices sometimes that seemed, juvenile and not in an interesting way. Sometimes that can be a creative choice, but in this case it just seemed like, okay, that's not super artistic, but whatever. So this didn't do it for me, and I was surprised because I was looking forward to this. I'd had it on hold at the library for a long time, but both the other poetry collection and the novel I had read. And I think maybe listening to this, even though it's read by the author, I feel like it just didn't work for me, which is not how poetry usually works. I usually prefer hearing the author perform it just because then you get a sense of the rhythm, but this was definitely not for me. However, looking at reviews, I think a lot of people who didn't like On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous do like this. So if you're one of the people who that book didn't work for you, this might be the poetry collection to join in on. But I don't have a lot to say about it beyond that because it did genuinely just feel like somebody was telling me stories and they were vaguely poetic, but not that much. And I listened to that at the end of November and I no longer remember much of it. So yeah, it hasn't had a lot of stickiness to it. The other poetry collection I read was from the African Poetry series, and that was a collection of Keorapetse Kgosicile's work from the 60s through the 80s. He was a South African professor. He passed away a couple of years ago, who lived in exile for a while during the apartheid era and then moved back. And this is a lot of the poetry that he wrote in the 1960s and 70s. And it is really interesting from a historical context because he's talking a lot about jazz music of the era, for example, and he's talking a lot about cultural things that are happening in the US with the civil rights movement and in South Africa with the anti-apartheid struggle, and also just with culture shifts and the experience of being in exile and all of that. When taken as poetry now, some of it just doesn't work because it hasn't aged well. Some of the terminology that he's using when he's insulting other people is politicized in a way that when you read it now, it seems significantly harsher. For example, when he's talking about racial oppression and he's using like homophobic slurs for the white police, and reading that now you kind of think that's questionable, but a lot of that I think rang differently in the 1960s. So I think viewed within the historical context it's really interesting, especially if you've read other books about the histories of the US and South Africa at that particular time, because that's what he's talking about. But I think if you were reading this and you didn't know when it was written and who it was written by, it would just make you uncomfortable because a lot of it is stuff that has not aged well just because of language shifts between then and now. And also positioning of things, like you wouldn't use certain homophobic slurs in a general way now. And I mean, you could argue about, well, they shouldn't have been doing it in the 60s either, but I think it was much more common then and not, how would you say it? The way it would be read, both kind of generally socially and politically, is in a very different spot now than it would have been 50, 60 years ago. So, but I did feel like this is one where if you are a person who usually skips the introduction, definitely read the introduction to this, because if you don't, you're losing out on a lot of the historical context of what's being said. And I think stripped of the historical context, it doesn't necessarily make sense and sometimes will ring, as I said, it hasn't necessarily aged well. Speaking of things that I don't think have aged well, although not in the same way, I also read Slavenka Drakulić's They Would Never Hurt a Fly, War Criminals on Trial at the Hague. This was written 20 years ago, and she is Croatian. She wrote this in English for a presumably Anglophone Western audience. And the thing is, 20 years ago, there was not nearly the amount of stuff translated from the Balkans as there is now. And this is something, the translator Emil Alcalay has talked a lot about that, about how things looked in the late 90s, early 2000s versus how they look now, and how much access to any cultural space outsiders are going to have. And so when this was written, she was giving an eye into something that just wasn't available in English otherwise. And the thing is, because she is specifically and clearly writing this for an outside audience by writing it in English, you don't have the same feeling that some other work that's been translated and that is written for a more internal audience is going to get into. So she has to explain a lot of things at a much more basic level without getting into some of the deeper stuff. So as a kind of overview and an introduction to some of the crimes against humanity in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s, it's no longer a great introduction. Also, there are a few parts where, especially she's talking about Milosevic and his wife, and she uses a lot of language, sort of like with the other one, except it's the language surrounding the way people talk about autism, for example. And she's using that as sort of a metaphor. And again, it's as with the homophobic language in the poetry from the 60s, a lot of the way we talk about autism now, or whether you would use that as a label, whether you would use that kind of language in a book like this, if it were written now versus 20 years ago, you would not. So some of that is kind of uncomfortable. It just hasn't aged well. People are not going to be impressed when they come across that if they're not keeping in mind that this is a book that was written 20 years ago when, one, sensibilities were different. And again, you can argue about that too. But, and beyond that, sometimes there are facts that have come out about some of the war crimes that happened, and we know more about it now than she would have known then. And so what happens with that is that, for example, she many times harps on 7,000 as being the number who died at Srebrenica. And we now know it's closer to 10,000, right? Because they've continuously found bodies over the years, not just in the first 10 years. Every year on the anniversary, they bury more bodies that they've found. So when she's harping on the number, and I mean, this isn't somebody doing genocide denial, it's just that we know more now. So if this is the book that you go to, you're not getting the up-to-date information, and you're getting some metaphors that are definitely not aged well. So this, again, it's interesting as a piece. If you think about what was available in English about those conflicts at the time that was written, and who she was trying to write it for, and what she was trying to bring in that wouldn't have been available otherwise, that's really interesting. I think if you were genuinely just looking to find out more about the genocide, about the various war crimes, there are more recent works that are going to do a better job just because a lot of the information was available when she wrote that. She is also doing in that kind of an interesting thing where she's trying to humanize all of the war criminals based on the philosophy that if you present war crimes as only being done by people who are monsters, as not the person who lives next door to you, that you're kind of separating the general humanity of that and ignoring the risks of it happening in any other country, because the reality that she's pointing out is a lot of these people went to school with or were befriended or were married to people who later they would see as subhuman and be killing. And not because they were horrific before, but because of a whole group of social pressures, and how even people who might have been uncomfortable with it would then be socially pressured into taking part in massacres, for example. And that's certainly a valid way to talk about it, because I think a lot of people do say, well, my neighbors are nice, so that they have some political views that I don't agree with is fine. So if they have some ethno-nationalistic views that I don't agree with, that's fine, they're not going to kill me. They might. That sounds depressing, but history has borne that out. All right, just in the last video I made, I was talking about a Rwandan book. That is another thing where, these things have happened, and they've happened recently. So, and finally, one of the things that I read for Nonfiction November and didn't have a chance to talk about is Alice Wong's Year of the Tiger: An Activist's Life. Alice Wong runs the Disability Visibility Project. So there is the book that's a compilation of essays that I've seen a lot of people on BookTube talking about over the past couple of years. She also has a podcast and a website devoted to the visibility of disability thoughts and issues. This is an interesting formatted book because it is sold as a memoir, but it's really a compilation of essays and interviews that she's written or given elsewhere, or interviews that she's done with other people for her podcast. So if you follow her blog and her website and her social media, you will have read a lot of this material already. There is some new stuff. There's especially illustrated sections and photos, and I think it's definitely worth it for that. So going into this, I had read a lot of this, but I appreciated having it all together, and I think that makes for an interesting package. And she talks in the introduction about how that's an effort to not write a disability 101 guide. This is sort of like when I talked about The Future is Disabled, Lee Lakshmi Srebrenika's book about disability justice and culture. Similarly, in the introduction to this, she is saying, I'm not explaining the basics of the social model of disability, for example, to you, and that she's not going to get into, if you're confused about cultural bits, whether it's about disability or whether it's about general access or whether it's about Chinese American culture, that you can look that up. She's not going to hold your hand for that. And by not writing a traditional memoir, I think that it allows her a lot more freedom to do that, to not be forced by editors to do that, essentially. I mean, she doesn't say forced by editors, but I think there's an assumption that any quote-unquote disability memoir is going to hold an able-bodied reader's hand and say, look. And that's not what she's doing. She's introducing you to her life and work. Now, one of the drawbacks of that is that sometimes there will be pieces in the collection that are a little repetitive. There is one bit where she has an essay and she's talking about an experience she had in school, and then there's an interview where she talks about the same story. And they come fairly, I don't think they're back to back, but there's maybe one thing in between them. And if you are easily distracted by repetition, I think that is a bit of a drawback. But I think as a collection, it's great. This is a book that I will definitely be giving to people. And I am going to say a lot of people who do bingo boards and say, read an intersectional memoir. And one of the things that she says in the introduction of this is that, no, do not say that. So every time it pops up on one of those things on Instagram, I'm like, haha, there we are. In any case, I do highly recommend this. Oh, and one thing that's really interesting in this is if you do follow her online, you'll have read some of her more recent writing because she's had some significant physical changes in her life recently. And so she has a piece in here where she's talking about food and about how at some point, she's probably going to have a G-tube and won't be eating anymore, and will you enjoy that? And that is something that has changed for her since she's written this. So you can read the essay that's in here and then go to her website and read her more recent thinking on that, how that's shifted. And that's kind of interesting as well if you are nosy about people's personal lives. And if you're reading memoirs, you're nosy about people's personal lives, right? Of course you are. So highly recommended. But if you follow her on social media, you will have read a lot of this already. I'm not going to talk. I was going to say I read a celebrity memoir. I will do something else for that later. In any case, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. Have you read anything that would have been great 20 or 50 years ago, and now you're reading it and thinking, oh, it's a shame I couldn't have read this 20 years ago, or before I was born, or it's a shame I couldn't go back in time and read this in the context in which it was written, because that would have been an interesting invented the time machine. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.